Hello. Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, hi. I was a speaker. They just recorded me for the women. This is Kumu Gupta. Is that ever going to be live streamed like this? He's going to play the recording, but I don't know if I can see the roundtable on Zoom.
Yes, it is.
The same link, right?
Yeah, it depends on which roundtable you need to be part of. This is roundtable 2.
Yeah, I'm in 3, I think. The women's roundtable.
Well, that's not being live streamed at all because there's no systems in room 3.
Oh, I see. So we'll see it on YouTube a little bit later, right?
Like I said, there's no systems in room 3, so I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
No problem.
Is this the right roundtable for? I'm Jacob Dorman. Is this the right roundtable for number 2?
Yes, roundtable number 2. You're in the right room. Yes.
Okay. And do you know when it will start?
It's going to start shortly.
Okay.
Jacob, can you hear us? Hello?
He's muted there.
Yeah, but he should be able to hear us.
I think it's on his side.
It's on his side, yeah, it's muted on his side. Because the sound is definitely bouncing on the side. Just go ahead with this room. This room is live. So go ahead with it.
Can minimize it.
But we're still frozen here. Just
But is our session going to be on Zoom when
yes.
there is this other person on Zoom?
Yeah. No, your
Okay.
session is can
It won't be
continue.
disturbed
It
by
won't,
this
it
one.
won't be disturbed by this.
Oh,
guy.
okay.
Let me just double check what's happening here. There's something wrong here with this camera. Let me just unplug it and plug it back. Okay, there. There we go. Let me just- Okay, give us sound here quickly. There. Okay. All good. So I'll minimize this and you can carry on. And the PowerPoint can be put up.
Okay. Colleagues, good afternoon. Sorry about our colleague that's supposed to be another group and is in our group. Can we start our session roundtable 2? And our first presenter is Prof. Jonathan Kavenda, UKZN. Swaraj, Doctrine, Discovery and Democracy, Indigenous People's Self-Governance in South Africa. We are lucky one of the presenters is not able to come, so you can have full 15 minutes. 15 minutes, thank you.
Across the world, the literature is saying that there's about 370 million indigenous people spread across 90 countries. That's a large number of people that we're referring to. It's not my slide. Okay, he's trying to find my slide. What I wanted to do was, I was fascinated that the Mahatma, was interested in such a diverse range of topics, and that indigenous people, can be located in his frame of, of justice. Where is it? It's called conference slide, this one here, GMK, it's with J Governor. Yeah. Okay. My apologies. So given this area of interest, and also, that the Indian experience for him would have sort of motivated him as well, to pay particular attention to indigenous people. You know the terminologies, that he's used to refer to tribal communities and so on. So I'll leave that for you because you already understand it. In this paper, well, for now that is, I just wanted to speak about 5 things. What sort of method I use very roughly. Explain very quickly the sort of concepts that I've used. But focus on these contradictions, because indigenous people have been treated so badly. And there's so many contradictions associated with government policy, including international policy. The Council for Human Rights of the United Nations as well, being among them, the World Bank included. They've never had or come together into a consensus to even get a clear definition of who indigenous peoples are. So I'll try and do that very, very quickly. And then focus very quickly on the South African situation. My findings are pretty ghastly about how we here in our local context have treated our indigenous people. As opposed to say India, India has one of the most progressive pieces of legislation. 2006, the Forestry Act. It is one of the most deepest and densest act that I've ever read, which basically distributes rights to individuals, to communities, to the ecology, just to the simple things of how wood is actually, gathered for cooking, for heating, and so on. So it's quite interesting. I'll do the contrast very quickly for you. And then my sort of final idea is, in the South African context, is all of this one big disguise, or is it really an attempt to bring indigenous people into the citizenry? So that everyone's actually treated very, very equally. But I'm skeptical that we actually do that here. I don't know how many of you have heard of the doctrine of discovery, but this comes from the Pope, right? It is what they call a papal bull. So sometime in 1436, the Pope basically, and remember this is law, this is papal law, right? Institutes what they call this doctrine of discovery. What it does is it gives certain countries, at that time, it was Portugal and Spain, it gives them the right, okay, to basically take ownership of land and anything on or above or below that land, right? And there was a certain kind of procedure that was spelled out in this doctrine of discovery. Now, South Africa was also part of this doctrine of discovery. There's physical evidence, of the Portuguese actually taking ownership of land here in South Africa. Then I'm going to just look at indigenous epistemology. Their knowledge systems were pretty advanced as well, and we're concerned that we're also going to be losing them. Indigenous institutionalism, I wanted to speak about that because governments are creating these different traditional institutions, everywhere across the world. Even in the most wealthiest part of the world, Canada, the US, and so on. Believe it or not, they're still using, a very old papal law, right, to still deprive indigenous people of their land and also of the natural wealth that's on that land or underneath that land. And then, really, in the South African sense, what is the Constitution saying? So Swaraj, I don't want to go there. You've heard a lot about it, but I wanted to just speak on Gandhi's book, Hind Swaraj. He wrote the book in 10 days, on the ship, coming from the UK to South Africa. I mean, can you imagine his mind, like lightning, putting together, a full book, and no libraries and all of that, like these professors do, they have to consult literature surveys and all of that. So it's one of the most fascinating pieces, of writing by Gandhi. Well, at least I think so. And I just picked on this idea, which is relevant to self-governance and the order of the soul, being organized according to the order of society. And for me, it really struck me as an incredible piece of deep thinking to bring the closeness, of the human person, as well as the sort of soul, as being part of this physical society, social relations and so on. The second concept is intertemporal law. Asha will know about this thing, Eli, because intertemporal law is fascinating. It's how the church, right, basically said something so simple, right, that today's law cannot interpret the law of that time. Right, and I'll read it out to you. Modern day territorial boundaries and land titles are to be judged by the law in force at the time the title was first asserted, and not by the law of today. What it's saying is that today's law cannot breach that law, right? Because of this very simple thing called intertemporal law. It's about time, and it's so fascinating because what it does is that it still allows modern governments to use the doctrine of discovery even today. And Canada is actually one of the culprits, the most recent culprits around gas and the oil sort of exploitation that's taking place in indigenous areas. Democracy, I've been thinking about it a lot. I'm becoming skeptical, and I'm really, Chair, I really don't know what democracy means any longer. You must forgive me for this, because I can't define it. I really can't. You want to go back to classical theory, or any of the sort of more modern, postmodernist sort of ideas of what democracy is, because I think that the state has been overrun, by private institutions. They basically run society. And the political economy, in the way we think about Marxist-Leninist understanding, is very different today. It doesn't, and I use the word, the global complex in place of this word democracy. So that's my substitute. This is a little analysis, that I do, where I sort of stretch the contradiction across, some kind of scale. All right. So I've taken these key concepts. The first one is protections, and I want to show you how the contradictions actually apply. Protections regarding indigenous people, right? So on my left, right, on your left as well, there is the effort to safeguard the rights of indigenous people, to allow them self-determination, to also, promote affirmative action for indigenous people across the world. This is actually happening. It's a policy, it's a government policy. But on the other side, this is what they do. The same governments, right, who intend to protect the indigenous people, continue to exploit them. They still exert different kinds of tyrannies. And, it's both historical, from the time of the conquistadors to the current period of the settler communities, who basically dominated, these societies. So settler communities would include Australia, the US, Canada, and so on. The second, arising from intertemporal law, is that on the one side, it supersedes ownership rights of indigenous people. It is, in a whim, in an absolute whim, it takes away the rights that indigenous people are entitled to, in the way we think about it ordinarily. And what is the consequence of this? The consequence actually is that it's instituted a new form of colonization. Well, at least that's what I think, relating specifically to indigenous populations. The word peoples, this is really interesting, Chair. In ordinary grammar, we would just wonder, so what's the big deal about, peoples? There's a comma there. And this is what's so fascinating about the term peoples, right? The institutions who are basically writing policies, conventions, United Nations included, governments, constitutions, and all of that, are reluctant to define indigenous people. And this is the reason, right? Firstly, international law, what's the contradiction? International law guarantees self-determination for everybody, you and I, everybody, irrespective of who you are. It guarantees self-determination, right? But the desire to retain the category of indigenous people is actually very, very curious. Why do they still intend to keep this category when they actually still treat them so badly. There's a very good reason for this, and I'll come to that, right? So that's a very interesting kind of contradiction, and I'll just finish that very, very quickly, because this is what's happening in today's world. The attempt to assimilate. Leave social engineering and all of that, what they were doing in Australia and Canada. I'm not even talking about that, right? I'm talking about how governments are intending to assimilate indigenous people into the majority population, basically to just wipe indigenous populations out, right? So that they don't get their rights, so that they're moved off from the land that they occupy, so that the private sector, what I call the global complex, can basically take over these places for the wealth that's actually out there, right? And that's basically the reason. Now, they're not succeeding at this assimilation because indigenous people have been fighting for quite a while, right? The Brazilians did something fascinating, at the climate talks. They developed their own sort of convention about the environment and so on. In South Africa, they went to the United Nations. They fought there. So it's over a 20-year period, that the Human Rights Council eventually agreed to pass this convention recognizing them, because they believe that they are entitled to their self-identity, to propagate, their culture, their knowledge systems, and so on. And of course, they deserve that right. The concept of minimization is really interesting. The mainstream society is developing social theories about, constantly developing new, and evolving social theories about indigenous people. And all of that is a clever strategy, to basically blanket out again, the rights of indigenous people. So you have this discriminatory, discrimination being perennial. It's continuing, going on and on. In South Africa, I've categorized our indigenous people into 3 groups. What's the one right at the top, right? Social licensing, Prof. Social licensing is where indigenous people give away their rights to the private sector. And we've done it so many times here in South Africa, it's happened, right? So it's a fancy term, right? Fancy term, but basically the private sector buys off these rights from indigenous populations. It's happening in St. Lucia, the same thing on the South Coast where I live, and so on. So ecotourism, for example, which our governments promotes as a way of, what they call development in the name of development, is also very, very suspect. So they promote these, these mundane things, arts and culture and so on, as part of tourism, right? And they refer to it as new rural development. So they actually theorize this as rural development. The second category, where traditional communities have been drawn into traditional governance, and we've just done it here, right? If you were watching the media, last month, our president Cyril Ramaphosa had met, with the Khoisan Council, which was recently instituted. So as recent as that, you have the presidency promoting, the participation of indigenous people in traditional governance. So this is how that assimilation process is taking place in South Africa. At one time, right, indigenous people, right, were basically, painted, with this term of being colored. So they no more were actually, using the term indigenous peoples. They were saying they were coloreds. So they put them into this category of so-called coloreds and got rid of indigenous populations altogether. Then they realized it's not working because the indigenous populations protested, as did the Chinese actually protest, about their race labels. So the drawing into traditional governance is pretty interesting, and how it pans out in the future would also be something that we must observe. And the last category have become victims to the daily politics because they are poor, right? And they're looking for whatever opportunities, and they've been detracted from this pursuit of their own autonomous life. I'll just be 3 more minutes, Chair. So this is what I've been saying to you. The legislation is in place in South Africa, right? The Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs Ministry is now responsible for traditional governance. It's responsible for the institutions, right? And it's basically, developed an act called the Traditional and Khoisan Leadership Act, right? And it's got that council. That's the one the president had addressed recently. Watch this. Apartheid, was really interesting for what it did and what it didn't do, right? And this is what apartheid did. The apartheid government actually recognized, right, and they secured, to a large extent, the promises of self-governance, whereas our government actually wipes that out. That's the interesting kind of treatment, of indigenous population, because I use the word assimilated. They're being assimilated as into the traditional leadership area, so they become like any other rural resident, right? So this is a picture of where the sort of Khoisan assimilation. Well, they basically being bunched together. And you see the categories there. We have the two blocks, if you like. The San, right, has three subgroups, okay, and then now how to pronounce it. I think it's called the Hu. And there's four categories of indigenous population. Now that again is a strategy to basically upset the subsets of traditional groups or communal groups. So that's my presentation. Thank you for listening to me patiently. Thank you.
Prof, thank you very much. And you are on time. I've just been made that kind of a prefect of time. But no, thank you for your presentation. Can I allow for one question if there's any? Yes.
Just to, I'm lucky there, I'm also just to say, from asked, Asha, that's why I'm thinking asking about the law. So the principle in law or activity that whether it's international law or domestic law, a law is never, unless it's clearly stated that it should be, it generally is never retroactive. So it doesn't apply to any incident in the past. So if something is a crime today and was not a crime yesterday, if today it becomes a crime, you can't then go and arrest and charge a whole lot of people for their conduct from yesterday when it wasn't a crime yesterday. That's the logic behind it, right? And that goes for everything, international treaties as well, that you might enter into a treaty today and be bound by those terms today, but yesterday when they were not there, you obviously shouldn't be bound by them. That's the principle. So just to explain that, just to share that there's a fundamental reason for that for that non-retroactivity of laws. You were talking about the temporal principle, right? And then about the doctrine of discovery. I'm not sure if you're aware, but on the 30th of March this year, Pope Francis and the Vatican issued a new, and they basically rejected the doctrine of discovery. And, it's I have the papal, the new papal bull, if you want to call it that, but where they reject that entire teaching as not an authentic teaching of the Catholic Church any longer, or an authentic, it's a change, very recent, just the 30th of March. Have you seen it? Okay.
The problem is this.
Please.
Asha is presenting a very nice argument, and she's obviously, as the good lawyer, has evidence, and she's brought the evidence, Sure, he's giving me 1 minute. The intertemporal aspect, right, of canon law is really interesting, because even the papal see itself is restricted to what it can change. You see, because there's this fundamental belief, right, that the function of the Pope or the papal see is simply to interpret. It can't undo something, right? Some kind of law, that was actually established at whatever period in time. So it's interesting how this Pope was actually done. But the popes do some very interesting things to each another, over time. I mean, there was a girl pope at one time, don't forget that. And that was never supposed to actually happen, right? So there were some really interesting things that took place. So I don't have an opinion on what last month's sort of thing. I'll think about it. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Can we give Prof. Gavenda a round of applause? I had allowed Prof to speak for the full 15 minutes because we had one missing speaker. The speaker is back. So the next presentations are going to be 10 minutes. So the next presenter is Dr. Jean Suba Rao. Not here. Maybe we still have time. Maybe we still have time. And the next speaker, therefore, is Uma. Please welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I had to develop courage to come down the stairs, and I think the chair can carry me up the stairs. My topic is Sarvodaya and cooperative living, the ideals of Phoenix settlement and the lived experience. It's kind of emerging out of my book on Phoenix settlement, which is 120 years of Phoenix, which we're aiming for the commemoration next year. So I wanted to start off by talking very briefly about the ideals of Phoenix, which people know, but I think it's important to just restate them. So in 1914, 6 months after he had left South Africa, Gandhi pronounced with some confidence, there is no institution today in the world to excel Phoenix in its ideals or way of life. By this time, Phoenix settlement, a 100-acre farm located in the Inanda countryside, was 10 years old. Gandhi had good reasons to come to this conclusion, for Phoenix represented the full Gandhian package on how an individual should live to create a just, equitable, and ethical society. It was one of his most important experiments, a distinctive settlement in colonial Natal. It brought together people of different faiths, class, gender, racial, and cultural backgrounds, and was multiracial. This paper explores the central ideas behind the experiment at Phoenix as they were conceived at the beginning and as they evolved over the first decade. So there was the ideal behind Phoenix, but a key question is how successful were residents in living up to the ideal in changing circumstances over the course of the 20th century, and what relevance does Phoenix settlement and the ideal hold in contemporary society. So just briefly to emphasize what Phoenix settlement stood for. The key idea behind Phoenix settlement is its location. It's in the countryside, far away from urban living. It was meant to be a press estate. It was meant for the press workers in producing Indian opinion. And so it represented a new model of economic relations where all employees, they were not even regarded as employees. They were all joint participants in an effort to come out with this newspaper. And they were all took the same wages. And if there were profits, they were going to share it. The economic ideal was inspired by the belief that the good of society as a whole could not be achieved if individuals became rich at the expense of workers. So Sarvodaya, the welfare of all, was at the heart of the origins of Phoenix settlement. And it went beyond the community at Phoenix. It was meant to apply to society as a whole. Important part of the press workers' experience was to be agricultural laborers as well and produce their own food. And in terms of labor, in terms of health, there was natural methods such as hydrotherapy, dietary restrictions were preferred over allopathic medicines. the whole idea was to demonstrate that people of different races, cultures, religions, and languages could live together. And I think that's an important lesson for today. Prayer services include all the religions and teachings. Simplicity was crucial to the lifestyle at Phoenix. And women were allowed to come out of given the opportunity to come out of the domestic space. The press workers were not only meant to be press workers and agricultural producers, but they were also meant to be teachers. They taught the children on the, so the Phoenix community constituted a family. As Phoenix continued, it became more of a satyagraha institution. The whole goal was to produce young people who would make sacrifices to change society. So if you want to sum up the project at Phoenix, you could say that it involved national and patriotic work, the work of social reform and self-sacrifice. You don't have to spell out the relevance of that for today. The thing about Phoenix is that people talk about these ideals. So what I've said is nothing unique, but I think we need to ask, so how did these ideals pan out? Well, for one, the idea of equal wages for everybody was not kept consistently. A lot of them drew the same wage, but there were exceptions. So one person got paid £10, another person got £3. So, but in general, they were paid equally. The other big change that occurred is that while the initial conception of Phoenix settlement was that there were going to be profits and it would be shared by the workers, by the time at the end of the decade, the whole question of profits just fell away because Gandhi said the Phoenix way of life could not be reconciled with monetary gain. There's an important shift. There's another shift was about land ownership. The idea was that workers would eventually get title deed to 2 acres of land or something like that. That was done away with. In fact, Gandhi did away with his own ownership of the land and handed over the trust to a trust deed. So the idea of individual land ownership also changed. I wanted to say that the ideal was hard to live for the people who were brought together for the first time to live together. And they had to adjust to caste differences, religious differences, so there were departures from the ideal if you take individual experiences there. And I wanted to just underline the advice that Gandhi gave to residents of what cooperative living entailed. He urged residents to take into consideration the virtues of a man. We could have said woman as well. We cannot bother ourselves about his drawbacks. His advice was keep our hearts pure and put a favorable construction in other people's doing. I think that's really an important part of cooperative living. The other important thing, they brought together people of different races, different languages, different cultures. And I thought this was really important when a German arrived at the settlement to stay and he encountered the Gujarati women and the Tamil speakers and so forth. Gandhi's advice to this person was to learn an Indian language so that you may understand the people around you and for whom you are working. That's another example of cooperative living. In the religious practice, I think he saw the greatest successes because there was a lot of cooperation there. The Hindu residents got up at 3 a.m. to prepare meals for the Muslims who were fasting. Now, I want to move to the more crucial part of my paper. If you could just signal me when I've got 5 minutes left, I'll be happy. So Phoenix settlement after Gandhi is really what my passion is, to talk about what happened after he left. I think the first calamity was the idea of the little village that he had created. There were 80 people living at the farm on the maximum. And after he departed, he took a lot of the residents with him. They went to India and they ended up at Sabarmati Ashram. And so the settlement was depleted. And so one of the first, Albert West was left behind and he said, this whole idea of a settlement doesn't even exist anymore. And then West himself left, and another, a change occurred. Instead of it being a settlement where whites and Indians mainly were living there, with the departure of the West, that whole thing fell apart. The survival of Phoenix was really due to the arrival of Gandhi's son, Manilal. And it was him and his wife and his children who actually ensured the survival of the settlement for the rest, for several decades afterwards, right into the 1980s. In terms of who lived at the settlement, besides Manilal and Sushila Gandhi's, there were actually 4 or 5 press families. And in that sense, they constituted a kind of family with cooperative living. One of the examples of this is Sushila would call all the children on the farm and have the prayers in the Gandhi house. And again, the interfaith prayers were, but this was slightly different from the conception that Gandhi had. In the 1970s, there was an increase in the number of families staying at Phoenix. About 15 Indian families were given permission to live at Phoenix as an act of humanity, for many of them were victims of forced removals that were taking place at that time. And then in the 1980s, 25 African families from the Hamanati township were offered accommodation at Phoenix after they fled the political violence that plagued the province. There's a lovely description by a reporter about how the African families and the Indian families lived at Phoenix. A reporter observed the refugees at the Phoenix settlement are living a communal life, cooking together and sharing the household chores. Phoenix settlement thus became a place offering refuge from the harshness of apartheid. So in its initial conception, Phoenix was meant to challenge the segregatory ideal of colonial society and to demonstrate that people of different races can actually live together. And so in the apartheid era, we have this whole idea that Phoenix settlement is a challenge to the very ideals of apartheid, very much like District 6 and Sophiatown challenged what apartheid was. You have Phoenix settlement doing that. So there was continuity in Gandhi's wish for the settlement to represent an alternate to the segregatory ideal, and for the settlement and the newspaper to oppose injustice. I could spend a whole paper talking about how political activism at the settlement continued after Gandhi left. From 1922, his son went to jail. And after that, I can recite a whole number of, there's about 7 attempts to go to jail, fasting, and so forth. But I want to highlight a particular incident in 1960, May, when there was a state of emergency and a large number of people were arrested. Hundreds were arrested in the aftermath of the Sharpeville massacre. So a newspaper reporter described the event at Phoenix where Sushila Gandhi fasted. There was at Phoenix settlement an atmosphere vaguely reminiscent of those days over 50 years ago, when Phoenix was the nerve center of Mahatma Gandhi's opposition to the discriminatory laws of this country. An interesting feature of the fast was the presence of a number of African men and women who joined in the fasting and prayer. And this is, the Sarvodaya pillars were decorated in the ANC flags as well. So we had African women and Indian women and the political activists, all of them gathering together at Sarvodaya. In the 1980s, Ila Gandhi, who's sitting here, and I don't know why she's listening to me because she knows all this. I told her to go to another session because she and Mewa Ram Gobind, they also became involved in the revival of the Natal Indian Congress and the United Democratic Front. And again, throughout the 1980s, with the inaugural Gandhi lecture from 1960s right to the 80s, Phoenix settlement became the place where people of all races congregated. The advantages, the 100 acres of land and advantages far from the city, away from the security police, and it was a space of freedom, unlike any place in the country. where people could gather together, people of different political persuasions. So the arguments between Steve Biko, Black Consciousness Movement, Congressites, Freedom Charter supporters, people who didn't like the Freedom Charter, all had an opportunity. And even those who participated in the Bantustan structures in the 1970s, they came to Phoenix. And so it was a space for everybody at that time. And then I want to talk about the first work camps that were held at Phoenix. The first work, Rick Turner was one of those who was very involved in that, Lawrence Schremer from the University of Natal. So what was the program of bringing university students to the work camps at Phoenix? It was actually a revival of Gandhi's idea that young people should be trained to fight injustices and to offer themselves, and to develop the spirit of activism. There were long hours, there were a few hours of agricultural labor. They surveyed the needs of the area. There were lectures on Africa, and there was also poetry and drama sessions. The Sasso group, Tekon, they actually performed plays there. So I wanted to underline what one youth had to say of his experience here, which is what Phoenix came to symbolize for him. Phoenix, for me, has been an oasis in the dry desert land of apartheid. So here's another, incident. I'm not doing well. So I wanted to say, the idea of Phoenix and Indian opinion, they were integrated. But how important did Gandhi attach to Indian opinion? What was the importance to that? And what importance to agricultural labor? And actually, he placed agricultural labor over Indian opinion. He actually said, if you can't live at Phoenix Settlement and farm, then please close up the place. You are not going into town. You cannot produce the newspaper in town. If you stay at Phoenix, you must pursue the agricultural project. It was crucial to that. And I found that it was interesting. He told his son, stop thinking of filthy Durban and remember why we moved from Durban to Phoenix. And so that whole idea of moving the press to Durban was put an end to. In terms of agriculture, I actually think in the beginning, West actually gave up on the agricultural project. He said, this is very dismal, it's a failure. They tried to grow this and it didn't succeed. They also didn't have time. How can you produce the paper and farm? So he really wanted to abandon the whole project. But Manilal came and he actually gave the farm a go. He started within a few years, he started planting maize and sugarcane. And this was actually continued into the 1970s. Asha's dad actually took to farming considerably, but it's in a different way because they used farm labor. It was not quite the original conception. There was farm labor, paid labor were used. And I thought what Rick Turner had to say about the agricultural project was really interesting. He said, we have undertaken several spectacular unsuccessful projects. In one, we had an amazing yield of half a bag of beans per bag planted. A series of Valley Trust type trench vegetable patches strayed into the path of a bulldozer, which was bad for morale and even worse for the vegetables. Indian opinion eventually folded after 1958. But I think, we must bear in mind that Gandhi actually didn't mind if it shut down. He gave his son permission to shut it down, even in the 30s, but he wanted Phoenix to survive with the farming, and that was important. What I wanted to say is that one should not make, the ideals of Phoenix had to adjust to the changing circumstances. So instead of a press, you now had the Mahatma Gandhi Clinic, and it, dispensed Western medicines, but it was Gandhian in conception, in the sense it was for the poor of the area and in the spirit of volunteerism that governed its operations. So it's an example of adjusting Gandhian ideals to suit the needs of the present. So what I want to talk about, just as my final final words, is about the current context. So currently we have, almost 80% of the land, over 80% of the land occupied by informal settlers. Phoenix is no longer as isolated from the city as it had been, because the urban environment there's been urban creep. And it's actually quite easy to get to Phoenix now with highways. Phoenix settlement from the 1950s also took on another project, and that is of heritage management, to look after the house that Gandhi lived in, and to, during the centenary, there was the building of a museum and a library. But, and the idea of how to keep Gandhi's idea of cooperative living alive is still an important element to consider. How does the trust who control, the small portion of the land deal with those who are living on the rest of the land? And so one of those ways was, how do you live in cooperation? And what the trust decided to do was to cede the land, cede about 90 acres of the land to the municipality for them to build houses. They didn't say, oh, this is our 100 acres, evict the informal settlers. But secondly, there's a relationship between the community and those who live there, and there's promotion of the vegetable gardens. The whole idea of an agricultural college was floated many times, and that never really took off. I think one of the things is that the agricultural college would have required additional land. The 100 acres was actually too small for a huge agricultural college venture. Phoenix still plays a role in terms of reconciliation and in responding to the violence in which the area is situated. So I just wanted to conclude that Phoenix is actually not just a place. We talk about Phoenix settlement, you must think of the ideas behind it. And Gandhi said, Phoenix can be taken anywhere, in any part of the world. And I think that's a very important thing. It's actually a mobile project. It can be taken, those ideals can be taken anywhere in the world. And so it's still, just to emphasize what these ideals were, alternatives to the inequalities of society, learning how to live together in cooperative living with respect to labor relations, with regard to class, with regard to race and gender, and for it to be a place of activism, volunteerism, promoting peaceful means, and to stimulate subsistence farming, and to do it in a way that takes care of the environment. So, my conclusion is that Phoenix might have changed, and that we should not look at things too rigidly, but that the ideals of Gandhi can be adapted to contemporary society. And one example is the fact that computer lessons are being taught, at Phoenix, and it's important. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Phoenix. Are there any questions, comments about Phoenix?
Thank you. Maybe a question. As we all know that, Gandhiji has so many values, and most of his values, today when we are just looking at them, they're spreading, all over the world. What might be reason of Phoenix project, as you have mentioned that, it's a kind of mobile, expanding project. It's not that popular around the world. What was the reason why that project is a bit behind comparing with any other values that Gandhiji was promoting?
Come this way. Come here.
I think it's not different from, what his ideals. In fact, what I said is actually the essence of Gandhiism. It represents everything that he stood for. And that is why Phoenix Settlement is important, because it was here, I think every single thing that you can think of what Gandhi was associated, fasting, it started at Phoenix Settlement. The interfaith prayers, it started at Phoenix Settlement. The idea of living together started at Phoenix Settlement. Some things changed as he went to India. So for instance, and even Tolstoy Farm. So at Phoenix, there were individual homes. In Tolstoy Farm, there were dormitories. The homes at Sabarmati Ashram, slightly different. If you go to Sevagram, there was sort of huts, for different people. So, but the idea of living together and every single, I challenge you to find me one idea that he had that you can't find in Phoenix Settlement. Thank you. I would love somebody to find that one idea.
There is a challenge for research students to find that one thing. Thank you.
Like Goshala, like a cow.
Oh, okay. I just thought of that.
That, because I know in Sabarmati, he's been in Sevagram also, he's doing, but.
Yes.
So while you said that, I also thought of another thing myself. So it is true, the protection of cows and so forth, that didn't actually occur there. Also, there's a difference. When he was at Phoenix, he practiced veganism. He said, don't drink milk. And he said, make almond milk. And he even gave you descriptions of how to make almond milk. But later he actually said, he promoted milk drinking later. He would tell his son Devdas, make sure you drink a glass of milk every day. So that changed, afterwards. But I was thinking of crafts. So crafts, so I'm answering my own question. I found out it's actually crafts were not a big thing at Phoenix Settlement. It was at Tolstoy Farm where they made sandals and carpentry. That was more in Tolstoy Farm than it was at Phoenix Settlement. And then in later years, when he was in India, he said, had I only done crafts work and things like spinning and so forth, then I could have taught the neighboring African population as well. So there we found two things. Okay, thank you very much.
Can we give a round of applause? Thank you so much. We are doing quite well in terms of time. I understand Dr. GN Subarao was supposed to give us a recorded presentation. We do not have it. The next presentation is coming from Reverend Stembiso Zwane. He is going to introduce his own thing. Introduce yourself whilst they're setting up your thing.
Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity. Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for making the time to be here. We don't take that for granted that you are here. I'm Stembiso Zwane. I work for the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics here at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and also the director of the Ujamaa Center for Community Development and Research, which is an organization that I will be talking about in this presentation and the work that we do as an organization. So my topic is reality, faith and action, migration through the lens of Gandhi, King and Mandela. And I will be drawing from the work that Ujamaa is doing, but using the principles of these three important leaders that we are engaging with their work. So the structure that I will be using is introducing this idea of space and how space is understood in my presentation and the work that we do as the Ujamaa Center. Then I will go into a threefold reflection on the contested space, which is the invited spaces of reflection, the invigorated spaces of resilience, and the invented spaces of resistance. And what is key to this is this whole idea of unity, justice, which leads into solidarity. The work that the Ujamaa Center is doing is based in the communities, the working class communities, grassroots communities, the unemployed, those who are survivors of gender-based violence, those who are affected by HIV and AIDS, the migrants, which is what I will be focusing on here today. Because migration is a global phenomenon that affects people differently, depending on where they are in terms of their context and how they understand the phenomenon of migration. And I will be using the ideas, some of the ideas of these three leaders, Mahatma Gandhi, who gave us a gift of the non-violence approach, the Satyagraha, that shook the world about this principle that most countries adopted as a principle that they would use to engage in their communities. Then I will look at Martin Luther King Jr. And his liberation theology, especially because Martin Luther was a pacifist liberation theologian. So I will look at what is it that we have learned from Martin Luther King Jr. And then we'll end with Nelson Mandela and Mandela's focus on issues of reconciliation and issues of development of communities from the grassroots as important lessons that we draw from as the Ujamaa Center. So the concept of space is quite contested. Again, it depends on your understanding of what space means to you and your own location. For us, we take our cue or our understanding of space from this understanding that is shared by this French theorist, Henri Lefebvre, who argues that space is a social product. It is not simply available, but it's as a neutral container that is ready to be filled. But space itself is a humanly constructed and contested process of control and domination. So in this context, space is an issue of power struggle between those who dominate and those who are dominated. And that's our understanding of space as contested because of our background and where we come from in terms of working class, Black majority being marginalized by an apartheid system that made them believe that they were superior to the white race. So that's our understanding of space, that space has to be something that is challenged, space that's something that is engaged critically so that it is able to be a liberating space and not an oppressive space. So in the case of migration, we work with migrants from East Africa and migrants who are based here in South Africa, here in the city, in Long Market Street. We have migrants there who are based there, who are accommodated there. The KwaZulu-Natal Council of Churches and the Ujamaa Center works with those migrants. We reflect with them on their struggles as migrants or as asylum seekers who come from other countries here because of different challenges. And when they come to South Africa, they are met with resistance. And from 2008, most of the migrants and asylum seekers were being attacked because of what was known as xenophobic attacks, which in my view is not necessarily xenophobic, but more like Afrophobia, because you don't see the same treatment when a white person from Europe comes to South Africa. But when a Black person from Africa comes to South Africa, there is this animosity towards a Black brother or a Black sister. So it's Afrophobia rather than xenophobia. So the first space that we look at is the invited spaces of reflection. And here, the argument that we make as the Ujamaa Center is that the space itself that is contested is a space that is contested sometimes because of the ignorance that people might have about some of the issues involved in this phenomenon of migration. Because people migrate for different reasons. And I've listed here 5 reasons that people migrate because of. And here, Mahatma Gandhi helps us to understand that violence is not an option when it comes to treating other people, because his approach on nonviolence was a rejection of physical and passive violence against anyone. And that approach was helping people to be able to think about peaceful dialogue rather than to use violence as a form of rejecting the other. And an example of this approach by Mahatma Gandhi was the Salt March in 1930, which received global attention, which was an example of how nonviolence resistance can be used to express a particular view of dissatisfaction. So the 5 Ds of migration looks at issues of demand, that people migrate because there's a demand somewhere else, and they have the skills that are required in that particular area. So when we are doing employment, for instance, you look within, and if you can't find someone with the skills that are required from within, you don't go outside of your country to look for that person. So there's a demand that will require that someone comes from another country into your country to work. So it's a matter of economics, the issue of demand. Secondly, is a matter of issues of demographics, that there is an overpopulation in one area and people simply move to other areas where they think there will be opportunities for them to be able to make a contribution. Issues around disasters, natural disasters. We have issues of climate change right now. And when people are affected by those natural disasters or climate-related disasters, they then move into other countries. Issues around disputes and war that happens in other countries does force people to migrate. And finally, distance. When families are scattered everywhere, there come a time where they want to be together in one space. Then there will be that movement of people. The second space is invigorated spaces of resilience. And here, as Ujamaa, we draw from Martin Luther King Jr.'s theology, pacifism, and as a pacifist, Martin Luther King advocated for human rights and human dignity as an important element of his theology. So his theology was based on the dignity of human beings and the inclusion of human beings, especially Black people in the context of North America, in the US. Even the work of James Cone now is what was important in terms of driving this agenda of inclusion of all racial groups and not marginalizing groups on the basis of race. So King was very clear about the inclusion of Black people in the struggle for liberation in the context of the US. And as Ujamaa said, we use liberation theology from Gustavo Gutierrez's understanding of liberation theology. And we use this through a contextual Bible study methodology where we read the Bible in context with those who are marginalized. And in this case, we read the Bible with the migrants who are marginalized on the basis of being foreign nationals in our country, in South Africa. And then finally, with the invented spaces of resistance, these are the spaces that reject the oppression of migrants who come from outside and advocate for peaceful dialogue and accommodating other people in our context so that we are able to have a dialogue that requires us to work together as communities. And here we draw on Mandela's concept of reconciliation to say that we are one people. At some point, a number of South African leaders were scattered everywhere in Africa during the apartheid era when they were exiled. They were in most parts of Africa. And there was no animosity towards them. They were accommodated and taken care of. And then there was a clear support from those countries to overthrow the Nationalist Party government that was an illegitimate government that was excluding people on the basis of race. So we were accommodated and supported to overthrow the government of National Party. But now that we are liberated, we have forgotten what the African continent did for South Africa. And we are now becoming Afrophobic. So the invented spaces are the spaces where we build capacity among the migrants themselves to use peaceful means of resisting attacks on them as people. And Ujamaa facilitates these processes to say, let's have dialogue. The church called Key Ministries International is a church that is accommodating migrants from East Africa and from West Africa who are here, including those who come from the SADC region. They are part of this church, and Ujamaa conducts contextual Bible studies with this church, inviting migrants to be part of that. And we're talking about this philosophy of Ubuntu, that I am because of others. Thank you very much.
Rev, thank you very much for your presentation. Another round of applause, colleagues. Reverend Zwane. We do have 4 minutes before the next, is it the next session or is tea? Before tea time, we've got 4 minutes. Questions? Yes. The roving mic. Yes. Yeah, we can hear you.
The whole question of
The word not xenophobia, Afrophobia.
now, when I look at it as a labor and research that as a labor, what I see is that discrimination or the tax happens at the level of poverty, where there are poor people around, and it's the poor people who are exempt. It's not the wealthy ones, even wealthy people who have come from the country. They I don't think that anyone of them have been discriminated against or attacked or anything. So I just want to ask, do you think that there is a problem at the class level, like the competition at the level of labor and so on, and at that level, because they feel that they are unemployed because of employment outside. So at that level, now can we do something to change that? In terms of pajama, my conception
Of pajama, and I would really like to hear from you, because I think it was started by Nyerere. Am I right? Yes. Julius Nyerere was the person who started that. And it was to sort of bring about a change in the class situation. Now, is there something that we can do in order to change that class situation, in order to address this issue? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Please respond.
Thank you so very much. I think you have put your finger in the area where the problem lies. That in South Africa, what makes this a problematic area is the issue of lack of economic resources for the poor and the working class. And the frustration that the poor and the working class have, they take it on people who come from outside. Because what they will argue, they'd say, foreign nationals are taking our jobs. And the question we always ask is, which job? Because there are no jobs in South Africa. People create their own jobs for them to be able to survive. Those who are smart enough in South Africa are able to go and sell on the street. They are called informal traders. They sell on the street whatever they can sell just to make a living. 2 years ago, I did a study with the unemployed young mothers who are earning a grant of about 420 rands, asking them what is it that they do with the money that they get from government. And because there was this narrative that they get pregnant in order to access a grant, which I thought was nonsense even before doing the actual research. And the research I conducted proved that that was really not well thought of, because they said we use half of the money we get from the state to buy bread and sweets or cigarettes and go and sell on the street. That's how we supplement the income that we get from government. So from 420 rands a month to almost 1,000 rand they generate as a result of selling on the streets. So that's how they supplement the money that they get from government to be able to survive. But others who are looking for an excuse to attack migrants simply say they are taking our jobs. And we ask that critical question, which job are migrants taking? Because they come here, open saloons, get a piece of land, open saloons, or get a space, cut people's hair, go and sell chips, sell fed cooks, which is what we produce in South Africa, but it's been taken over by others who are smarter than some of us. So it's not entirely true that South Africans are xenophobic. The issue that we have raised is quite correct. That is the socio-economic challenges where our government has failed dismally to give people what they promise, which is a better life for all. There's no better life for all in South Africa, but a better life for the few. What we can do, Ujama works with the young people who are unemployed, and we're trying to create this culture of entrepreneurship, to say, let them start small, selling something, and then we look for support elsewhere for them to start moving into a bigger space in terms of the market. And then through that, they can even employ others. That way, they are trying to deal with the issue of unemployment, which the government has failed dismally to resolve. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yesterday, someone said to me, Zwane, if you have got 4 dogs and you want them to fight when you are eating, throw one bone to them, then continue eating your own meat. So we are fighting in the streets and people are eating well. They throw only one bone. Colleagues, thank you very much for this. And that's my last session to chair. I'm free now as well. Let's go for tea. Thank you. Oh, okay, thank you.
Hello? Hello?